they do is they come back again and again, and they give us support time and time again. And that's what enables us to make a sustainable difference. Helps them make a sustainable difference too. There's lots and lots of online research or research that is available online to back this up. But to me, it actually makes common sense. You know, if we go back to that French cave, who wants to sit around a campfire in a French cave with somebody who just moans about how cold it is, or whose stories always end up in somebody dying, rather than stories that end up with stomachs that are full of berries and maybe mammoth meat? Nobody wants that moan. We want to be people and organizations that take others on a journey that engages in highs and engages in lows and hopefully finishes on a really wonderful high. A kind of story that releases endorphins, and makes our audience feel good about themselves. You know, I had a couple of paracetamol this morning. We want to be the paracetamol to the world's headache. That's what we want to do. And if big business can do that, which they're doing in marketing now when they're selling shoes and iPhones, surely we can do it as well. And hopefully we can do it much more authentically, because we are making the world a better place in our own little ways. So let's think about chapter 2, we can call this, can't we? Key elements. Now, all stories need characters, don't they? And setting is important too, but characters enable people to connect with our story. And interestingly, if we go into the world of fiction, maybe even non-fiction, right enough, it's not the strong characters that people connect with. It's the flawed characters, the real characters. If you ask people who their favorite character is in Lord of the Rings, they won't often say the strong characters of like Aragorn or Frodo, but they'll say Samwise Gamgee, who's the large-hearted, slightly foolish sidekick. In Harry Potter, they've got that same character, apart from they've got a different name. The name is Neville Longbottom. In Game of Thrones, you've got a character who's exactly the same as well, called Samwell Tarly. Do you ever wonder why Winnie the Pooh, the stories, are so endearing and have lasted for so many years and are still engaged by children today? It's because look at all of the characters. They've all got their own flaws. Tigger, far too much energy. Winnie the Pooh forgets everything. Piglet is terrified. Rabbit, stressed. Eeyore is always feeling low. You identify with those characters. You can kind of take this into imagery and pictures as well. One of the most striking images of the past 100 years, in my opinion, is that man standing in front of the tanks at Tiananmen Square. Do you remember that? And he's on his own and he's facing down a row of tanks. But what really sticks out to me is the fact that he's got his bags of shopping with him. He just popped out to the shops and then something extraordinary happened. He was doing something very normal, something that I understand. And then something very extraordinary happened. And that's how we need to start thinking about the characters that we feature in our stories. They need to be relatable to those who are reading the story. They need to be understood as people who are like the audience. And every single charity, eventually, if you dig down deep enough, does affect people. Environmental charities affect people. Charities engaged in research affect people at the end of the day. And that's a really important thing to consider when we are talking about storytelling, is because when we want people to give to us,
yeah, as we
our storytelling in fundraising, one key technique that we can use is just to focus our stories on a single individual, a single person. Maybe it's a single animal if you're doing if you're working with animals, because people give to people. People don't tend to give to organizations. The organizations are a funnel for them to give to people. So we need to show them that their characters in our story is real. We need to show them that they can identify it. We need to show the struggle that the person is dealing with. We need to show them that actually the audience who's engaging with this, they maybe quite like this main character that we're talking about. But this main character is dealing with something that's different, something that's strange, maybe something that's uncomfortable or unjust. But of course, then we need to show the heroic aspect of our character, how they come through. The hero of our story can never be you as the charity. The hero of the story is always that service user, beneficiary, client, however you term that person whose life has just got better. On occasion, in fundraising, the hero might be the donor, and that is appropriate from time to time. But the hero in our story is never us as the charity. Now, that might sound a bit strange to you if you're fairly new to fundraising. But think about it like this. Nobody falls in love with a character who shows off and talks about how good they are all the time. And that's the case for our charities as well. If we're constantly saying, we do this, we did that, we did the next thing, we're really great, people turn off from it. So make the hero of your story those who are benefiting. I was once working with a youth organization, and they ran an annual appeal, which was very story heavy, actually. It was very good like that, very visual as well. And usually it was authored by one of the very well-educated charity directors. But one year when I was involved with it, we changed tack. And we had a teenage school dropout write the appeal for us with a bit of support, of course. And the reason we did that is because she was the one of the young people that the charity worked with. And she was handpicked because we knew that her story ended in success because she was training to be a volunteer at that time with the charity. And so we shared her story. We shared it with bad grammar. We shared it with the slang that she used and the colloquialisms. And the appeal was a brilliant success. It actually raised over 3 times the amount that an equivalent appeal a couple of years earlier had raised. And that was because it was real. Because instead of somebody else sharing another story, it was somebody sharing their own story. And while she did give credit to the charity, it was her that people connected with. And it was her that came through as the hero of her own story, because that's how we got her or encouraged her to write it, to build up her own confidence, to equip her better for life. So take a step back. People know that none of these changes that we feature in our story happen without you as an organization intervening. So you don't need to worry about them starting to ignore you, but take a step back and let those you support be the heroes of your stories. I mean, we've got another character, which is the villain. The villain doesn't actually have to be a person like the hero does. The villain can be a concept or a situation or something like that, but that's usually fairly straightforward. And the idea of that villain should come to your mind nice and easily, I hope. So let's carry on. So we know about our character, remembering that for fundraising, one character is better than lots of characters. And likely with that character, we've got a setting for our story as well. We've got a kind of backdrop that we know. So how do we go about structuring the story? Well, just about every charity storytelling session that you will go on will tell you about something that's called the hero's journey. It's a storytelling arc. Think about Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Lion King. It's a good one, which is why it's used so commonly. And what it does is a weak character is called into an adventure. They refuse to go, but then they meet somebody inspirational and they cross this threshold into a roller coaster of adventure that ends in them doing something fantastic. And it's a very well documented format, this hero's journey, and it is successful. However, it's not the only way you can structure a good story. And actually, no matter how long or short your story is, a story act can help your story sound different to other organizations. Sound different to yourself 6 months ago. Keep it fresh for people. And I mean, we're going right the way back through history here. We've got St. Augustine of Hippo, which is the first one that or the oldest one that I could find, through various different authors from various different contexts and cultures as well. A good story blends the creative with the logical. And having a story like this can really help with that logical part, especially if you're potentially pulling apart someone's story to make it suit your purposes, or maybe you're compiling lots of different people's stories and presenting them as a single story, which is okay to do through fundraising ethics if you let folks know that it's a compiled story that you're sharing. That can help the coherence of the story, doing that with a story app. Now, if you look at them, basically they all follow the idea of everything is great. Oh, no. Oh dear. Everything's great again. But that would maybe be oversimplifying things that people go to university and study. So we wouldn't want to do that, would we? But having a story act can really help bring it together and give it that idea of a coherence and a flow. So we've got a character, we've got a story arc that we've worked out. And actually, at this point, you've probably already got a story that you're ready to start shaping, and you've probably actually already started shaping it. But what's the part of a story that we remember the most? Well, typically it's the end. Having a great resolution, which in the movies is usually accompanied by a stirring soundtrack, you know. Arguably, this is the most important part of your story, because it's at the ending that we get to leave that good taste in people's mouths. The idea that we want to leave them with successes. And we want to also leave them in fundraising, typically with an invitation to get involved. When we're looking at creating a lasting impression, this is also where the emotions really kick in. As well as this kind of good feeling, we also may want to leave them with a challenge or maybe a question for them to wrestle with, maybe an open-ended conclusion or a discussion point, maybe. I'm a bit of a sci-fi geek. I love my space and all that. And there's an author, a sci-fi author called Brandon Sanderson, and he is quoted at saying something that really, I think, sums up the genre of science fiction really well, but also what we hope to achieve through fundraising. And he said, if I read my notes, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think on. Who knew that science fiction and fundraising had a crossover apart from myself? But there it is. In our operations, what we do as organizations, we seek to bring around change to people, change to communities, change to the animals, change to the environment, whatever it might be. And if we're looking at generating support for that change and ingrain that idea of change in people, it's to get them thinking about it, talking about it, discussing it. And our stories can do that if we look to end them well. We should try and avoid stories that end in unresolved situations. or unsatisfying situations would be a better way of saying it. We want to avoid forced or hurried endings because we've suddenly run out of words or we can't quite fit it all onto a piece of paper. We also want to avoid fantasy. As we said, we're talking about the real world here. We're not in Narnia. So we don't want to be making claims that are potentially unrealistically big or offer a once in a lifetime resolution as though that happens all the time. Now, how you do this and how you end your story is entirely dependent on your character and the context that you operate in as well. And there's no silver bullet for getting this right, apart from practice and also seeking out the opinions of others, which can be quite scary, I know, but it is really valid to do. The final aspect that we need to consider is the audience that you're writing to, because you are all going to be telling stories to different audiences. Some of you will be writing to donors who already give. Some of those you'll be writing to people who have never given before. Some of you will be writing and sharing stories with businesses, with affluent people, with people on the margins, with people who you want to volunteer rather than give, with grant providers. What demographics or maybe other areas of commonality does your audience share with your hero in the story? That's an important thing to think about before you actually press the send button and publish it. What platform are you using to talk to them on? Connect with people very differently on Twitter than you do in person at a presentation or via a fundraising letter that you send out maybe at Christmas time or Valentine's Day. Let's take, for example, different audiences, maybe a donor versus a non-donor, somebody who hasn't given you. So for people who are already giving to you, you want to share a story with them. But the main tone that goes through that story is probably going to be one of gratitude, saying thank you for enabling this story to happen because it is you who's made it happen. And while that's potentially you want a bit of inspiration in there to maybe give a bit more. If you're writing to non-donors, you don't need that thanks because they've not actually contributed yet. But you want to lay into that theme of inspiration. You can get involved and make this story happen again to another hero down the line. Different angles because we're writing to different audiences. If we're going to grant providers, for example, our stories won't have as much need for that emotional course. Everyday donors make decisions on giving based on their emotions. Grant providers don't. They have frameworks that they score your applications on. So the stories that we share with them tend to be much less about emotions and much more about the actual changes that come around. Different focus because it's a different audience. And also think about what stories your audience actually like. J.R.R. Tolkien and, let's say, Terry Pratchett, they're two of the most significant and talented storytellers of the past 200 years. Their works have sold countless copies. Well, you could probably count them if you tried, but I'm not going to do that. But I'm not their audience. I don't like those worlds that they create because for me, there's too many characters and I can't identify with them quite well enough. And I'm probably in the minority saying that right enough, but I'm not their audience. And in our fundraising, it's important to realize that not everyone is our audience. And what we can find out about our audiences is going to let us tailor our stories to them, give them what they want, which is going to boost the effectiveness of our stories as well. How are they going to engage with the stories? What do they want to hear? What has worked in the past? Finding that out is really important. Okay, let's go on to the next chapter as I have a sip of my cold cup of tea. Planning. Now, people tend to roll their eyes with this next element when I mention it. But as with all creativity in fundraising, you can save yourself a lot of stress and a lot of scrabbling around if you've got some like planned intentionality behind what you're doing. In this case, behind collecting stories. And this is a process. It sounds a bit raw, but it is. It's a process. And the first and best thing that you can do, as we've got on this slide, is don't try and do all of this alone. Prime and hand select a few people involved in your organization to be on the lookout for stories. And if they want to collect the stories too, it saves you a job right now. They don't have to be staff. They could be volunteers. They could even be service users, to be honest, if that's appropriate for you. And you want to prime them and say, can you keep an eye out or an ear out for stories that are different? Something's a bit different about them. Because when we just collect stories, what we often find is that as the stories we collect are very similar. And we can find ourselves forced down a route where we just kind of share the same stories again and again. Maybe they're just wearing slightly different clothes. But by doing that, you end up in a bit of a boring spiral, boring for the audience, but also boring for you as you're pulling these together. And you start to sound like every other charity. But you're not like every other charity. You're special, you're individual in your own ways, and you want that to flow through your stories. So when we're thinking about different stories, think about stories maybe from new people who are fresh to you. Also, think about stories from people who have been around and are maybe part of the furniture, as we say. Think about stories that come from service users, from volunteers, from their families, friends, or loved ones. Potentially staff, but that doesn't tend to fly very well in the fundraising world when there are other options. Collect stories from people of different heritages, from different ages, from different educational abilities, from different socio-economic standings. It all helps keep our messaging fresh. And in the same way, when it comes to share stories, we can share stories that are complete. We can share stories that are still a work in progress. I mean, if you're feeling brave and you can put a positive spin on it, you can even share stories of failure if you dare. Be careful here, though, when it comes to planning. I worked with a charity that took the planning to an extreme. They would sometimes plan a year, maybe even, well, on one occasion, 3 years ahead for what themes they would be doing their fundraising under. And then months and months later, the fundraisers would go out, or the staff would go out, and they will be asked to find stories that could be shoehorned in to this funding theme, this funding need. Unfortunately, that meant that many of their best stories got ignored because it was a slightly larger organization with different projects. I think it's important to let the stories lead. It's a genuine route that to maximizing your income. That's because the best stories you collect are likely to come from the best work that you do. So don't be afraid if you do multiple elements of work through your organization to talk about one a bit more than the others, because that's likely the one that's going to resonate with people and hopefully enable them to give more. So planning is good. It needs to be done, but try not to be too rigid. Collection methods. There are lots of different options to consider when collecting stories. But what is most important to consider is the needs of your storyteller, the person whose story this belongs to. How are you going to make them feel comfortable? Especially if we're talking about emotions or we're talking about sensitive subjects, which many of us will be dealing with. What steps can we take to help them be open and honest? And if maybe the hero of our story is somebody who's maybe non-verbal, what can we do to make both them included in the process, but the person who we're talking to and getting that verbal story from, maybe it's a carer or a parent, what can we do to make them comfortable as well? I wanted to capture stories of three teenagers. They were siblings, exactly 2 years apart in age, and they were all really bright red-headed kids. So it was a brilliant kind of photo that I had in mind. But I knew their story was interesting as well. Um, the thing was that these three siblings were painfully shy. And talked to their parents, and it came through, and folks who knew them, and it came through that they loved Snapchat. It was back when Snapchat was the fashionable thing to use, and they loved YouTube and all of that as well. So we came up with an idea. What we did is we borrowed a really nice house from somebody in our network, and it had a really beautiful kitchen, and it had a really lovely conservatory. And we invited those three siblings with mum and dad as well to come over to this fancy location and share their stories with us. And we brought in professional lighting, which we just hired for 20 quid from a place. I'm up in Glasgow, from a place in Glasgow. And we hired big cameras as well to make it feel like they were special. And we brought in their favorite donuts, which I think they weren't Krispy Kremes, they were another chain of donuts. But we went and picked those up. We made sure that their favorite fizzy juice was there as well to make them feel comfortable. And then what we did, instead of talking to them first, we talked to mum and dad first, individually. And mum did a brilliant job because mums are brilliant. And dad, well, we had a laugh at dad because dad messed up, and that helped relax the kids as well. And actually, we didn't need the parents' stories at that point, but it was all just to make them feel comfortable. Actually, it was quite convenient because we did use the parents' stories at another opportunity a few months later that we didn't know was going to arise. So that was quite convenient, right enough. But what will make your storytellers more comfortable is probably the only thing you need to be concerned with here. There are lots of different methods for collecting stories, but let your storyteller lead. It's more important than what's necessarily convenient for you. And that's something that I have to remind myself when I'm collecting stories. No, it's not about what's going to work for me. It's about what's going to make that storyteller open up as well. Now, finding people who are willing to share stories, and then those stories actually being good stories, is a bit of a tricky task. And there are a few obvious and maybe less obvious tactics that you can use to help uncover and create the best stories. First of all, is that whole idea of it is permitted to compile stories from different people and present them as though they are one person. As long as you state somewhere within that kind of the scope of that story that it is a compiled story or a compiled case study is another form of language for it, that is fine, and that falls within the guidelines as set out by the fundraising regulator. If you've not read the guide from the fundraising regulator, you should go and read that if you're engaging in fundraising. It's written and designed for people who are not fundraisers to engage with it. So it's not full of jargon that's unexplained. And it lets us know how we should behave in relation to storytelling. So do go and read that when you've got a spare 20 minutes to do. So compiling stories, that can be a key thing that you can do. Explore that. Sometimes, more often, should we say, people need help in unpacking their stories. And there are two really strong things that we can do here. The first thing is to listen. It's a bit obvious, isn't it? But I mean genuinely listen, so you can ask open-ended questions about what's going on. Now, open-ended questions, if you're not sure, they're questions that have a long form answer. So it's not just a word or two in an answer. People go into more detail. Alone, this isn't quite enough, and you can actually find yourself stopping listening to what the person is saying because you're thinking, right, what's the next question I'm going to ask? But what we really want to do, the second thing, is to try and make that storyteller understand that you're in this story with them. You're involved and invested in this story as they're telling it to you. Using phrases and questions maybe like, I don't understand that. Can you explain it to me in another way? That can help the storytellers feel like they are being listened to and that you want to genuinely understand their position. And for you, it can also draw out additional details that can help you provide clarity for the audience who you're going to know much better than your storyteller's going to know. Maybe questions like, I don't know, I've got no idea how I would feel should I be in that situation. What was going on with you? What emotions were you playing with at that particular time? That lets questions like that are deep and bring us into the story, lets the storyteller see that, yeah, they're in control of this story and this is their story to tell, but also helps us as we're looking for those emotions that we know hopefully are going to make our stories sing. And also, don't forget the senses: sight, smell, touch. um by using the emotions, by setting the scene well, by using the senses, we draw people um, into the story. Um, but we don't need to just stick, remember, to words. Photos and videos can help draw people into the story, can't they? Quotes from other people that add to the context of that story can work as well. There's a really brilliant fundraising campaign that was done in World War II from Great Ormond Street Hospital. Which Great Ormond Street Hospital, Children's Hospital in London, was bombed during the Second World War, and they needed to rebuild it because it was a significant, and still is, a significant institution. And there was no money in the UK during the war because all of the money was going on the war. And so they realized that they needed to raise money from America. And so the chief surgeon, or whoever is the head of Great Ormond Street, wrote down this fundraising appeal and sent it out to folks in America to hand it around to their networks. Now, that's all very well and good, and there's nothing actually special about that. But what really made that appeal pop is how they brought the reality of that story to life with those who were reading it. Because what they did with every letter that was sent over, they enclosed a little envelope that had a little bit of rubble from Great Ormond Street Hospital in it. So when that person opens the letter, yes, they're reading about what's going on and they're actually holding a bit of the damage. It brings that story to life, and little elements like senses, little elements like photos can really help bring stories to life. Of course, we do need to protect our storytellers as well, and offering anonymity is a very important thing. And, showing somebody else's face instead of their face if they need to be protected, that is something that you need to do and you need to champion. And actually, that can help your storyteller open up to you if you promise you're going to do that as well. And the last point that I want to end on is the fact that authenticity really is a key. There was a book that I engaged with called The New Ethics of Journalism, and it came out 5 years or so ago. And the two authors who had written it wrote it to address the whole fake news thing, which isn't new, by the way. There has always been fake news going on. It's just it's got a new form that's presented to us at the moment. Anyway, in that book, they spent the first third of it, about 90 or so pages, getting at one thing. And that one thing is, unsurprisingly, people want genuine stories. And they proved it in lots of different ways, right enough. They don't want this fake news. They want authenticity. But this can be quite challenging for us, especially if you're like me and you're a bit of a control freak, because it's very hard for us to share a story without editing it, because we need to edit it. We need to edit it for better understanding of our audiences. We maybe need to edit it slightly to better fit our need. Sometimes we need to edit it to sanitize it so it's appropriate to be shared. Or maybe we need to edit it to emphasize that heroic point, especially if we're talking with humble folk. Sometimes the people that charities work with are really quite negative people because the cards have been stacked against them their whole lives. And so we need to edit it to find positivity because we don't want to portray negativity. And we have to do that. But we need to be careful, don't we? I personally think, and this is based on nothing but my personal opinion, that it's incredibly important to try and maintain the voice of the person telling the story through all of your edit. There's nothing worse, for example, than being told a story about a displaced person that's been told in the voice of a fundraiser who studied English at Warwick University and has barely stepped foot outside the Midlands. That's not authentic. And it's okay if the people you engage with, your storytellers, sound different to how you sound as a charity. They've got a different voice to your communications volunteer or person. It's okay if you're sharing stories of children via video that are really short and lacking in details, because that's how children communicate. I've got 2 kids. How was your day at school today? Good. There's no stories there, is it? One of the best ways I've found, practically speaking, to ensure that somebody's voice is maintained through the stories that I've wrestled with and edited, is to give them sign off before that story goes to print, as it were. Share that story back with them. Ask them if they feel that's a good representation of their story. Also, let them know exactly what you're using it for. If you're using it for fundraising, say, listen, we're hoping this is going to raise us a few £1,000s by just sharing your story. Just thought you would like to, we'll let you know how we get on. Do you know, I've seen a fundraising. It's a really inspiring image, which is probably why it stuck with me. Sitting down with a heavily disabled, non-verbal person reading the story that their mother had told us about, or told them about the situation, reading it to them to make sure that they still got sign off from that heavily disabled non-verbal person. And of course, the parent was there and was able to translate the body movements and the facial features that showed sign off for them. It's all about dignity. And when we're championing the heroes of our stories, we're saying people are the heroes of their own destiny, as it were. That's dignity. When we're offering to protect our storytellers by changing their names or changing their genders or changing their locations, for example, that's bringing dignity into it. And when we're sharing people's stories back with them and saying, is this true to you? Are there any other changes you would suggest? That's bringing dignity into it. And in fundraising, dignity works. Portraying that dignity really, really works on the bottom line. And so that's what you want to do. Now, I will just finish with a caveat, though. This is their story, but it's fitting into your fundraising program. So you do have final sign off. It's you who bears the responsibility for what happens next. So you do get final sign off, but do share it back with them. I've never had a bad um a bad experience in doing that. Now, it's really hard to fully capture storytelling in such a short session, and we've probably failed to do that utterly, to be honest. But I do hope that there are a few golden nuggets for you to take away. Let's just have a recap of where we went, though, before we stop for a little Q&A over the last maybe 5 minutes or so. Stories, they're vital. They're vital for us in fundraising. They're vital for us in finding new volunteers, for finding trustees, for finding people to open up their contacts. They're crucial. They're also important to us on a basic human level as well, aren't they? They're very important. And when we're talking about fundraising and sharing stories, typically we're sharing stories that involve emotion and change. And we've got the key elements. We've got characters, and we want our characters to be people that others can identify with. We've got our story act, which is going to help us hopefully sound different and keep our stories fresh, and the importance of having an ending as well. And then we went to talk on a bit more practically about how to plan it out, the importance of sharing the load when it comes to collecting stories and looking for those different stories, because that's going to help keep things fresh for you. Now, I usually get asked as well, Dave, do you have examples of good stories that you could share with us? And of course I do, but I'm not going to share them with you because they're good stories, in my opinion. And my opinion means absolutely diddly squat compared to the opinion of the folks that you are writing to. So, how to find good stories? First thing you should do is go and sign up for the mailing list, or throw a small donation at charities that are doing similar work to you at different places around the country, potentially even around the world. Because when you start getting their newsletters through, then you join their mailing list and you start reading it and engaging it, you start hearing stories. You start getting links to YouTube videos, which are very effective for sharing stories as well. And you'll find ones that resonate with you. And what resonates with you, hopefully, will be a good place to start with what resonates with your audience as well. And the second place to go, which is where I found out about that Great Ormond Street appeal, is a website. It's called sofii.org, SOFII.org. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a fundraising archive. It's a British archive that's made, so a lot of it is British content, which is great. And it shares stories going back through time and things that are happening recently that are just, well, they call it innovative. But go and have an explore of that, because you can find some really wonderful examples of stories at sofii.org. Okay. That's the end of the session. We'll have a little time for Q&A. Triceratops Training, we've just launched some impact courses, and a big part of impact at the end is storytelling, and we've got a session called Communicating Your Impact. So if you want to come along to that, it's kind of in the same vein of what we've talked about today, but it's not repeated material, so that might be quite useful for you to come and check out at triceratopstraining.co.uk, and also keep your eye on what's available through Central Surrey Voluntary Action as well. Brilliant. Now, does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? If we run out of time, feel free to email me. My email address is my Zoom name here, and you can ask a question offline. Maybe asking a question in front of all of these folks is a bit scary for you. Feel free to do that. But if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question just now, now is the time to do
it. Dave. Hello, Dave.
Hello, Peter.
Hello. Sorry, I've just posted you a single email. Unfortunately, due to logins on Eventbrite, I missed most of your presentation. So I've just seen the last synopsis slide. Are you going to be sending anything round, or can you send something round as a PowerPoint?
Peter, hello, Peter. It will
Hello.
be posted on the Central Surrey Voluntary Action website on the funding page under training on that page.
Okay. Thank you very much, Beverly.
I'll send you, Peter, I'll send you a link after this meeting. I've already put it in the chat, but I'll send you a link.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It won't be available there, Peter, for several days, probably going into next week. Okay.
Yep.
Doesn't happen immediately.
Thank you.
And I must apologise because I was letting people in doing things on the chat. I did actually switch the recording on a bit late, so you missed the first 2 slides, but 95% of it is there, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions for David?
I have a small question. I mean, I think, David, you covered so much that it was really good. So it is only a small question, but obviously, in an ideal world, we can make videos and we can do all those sorts of things, and there's lots of tips for that. If you're, a lot of when you're applying for grants, you have a very, very limited word count, and it is just a Word document. Have you got any advice for, when we really are stuck and we've only got a few words and it's literally just words? Is there any extra tips you would give us for that scenario?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a very good question, Laura. Thank you. Don't talk about emotions. What you want to focus on is talking about changes. What changes occur? Don't waffle on about what you do. You need to talk about what you do to lay down the context. But what grant funders want to fund is change. So talk about the changes that happen, more so than actually what does happen. So you need to mention that for a bit of context. And unless you've got an amazing USP, which is going to change the world, you don't need to talk about that very much. What you need to talk about is the changes that come around as a result of, well, of your work, but more importantly, that are going to come around as a result of their funding. Because that's what they want to fund.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And I just say, when I say that, it sounds dead simple. In reality, it's much harder. So good luck. Have a practice. But yes, that's where you need to focus on the changes that happen. We call it the impact, the outcomes. Sorry, of what you do. That's brilliant question, Laura. Very important question as well.
Any other questions for David? Right. Okay. Well,
if you wake up,
you can actually email him.
Yes, please do. Yeah, please do.
Email him if you think of anything. And it remains to say thank you very much, David, for this very informative and thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure people have a lot to take away. Some people have left early and they've said thank you very much in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Now this sometimes we run another session in the final quarter of the year. So if you have any ideas that you particularly want a session to be on, please email me and I will do my best to accommodate that. So if not, I'll say goodbye to everybody and thank you, David, once again, and I'll see you all next time, and you know how to contact me. All right.
We'll hopefully see you again. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you very much.
David, you want to stay on for 2 minutes?
Yeah, of course.